Yeah, so let's start. So first topic is from Sergey, but compiled interceptors. So do we discuss it now?
Sergey, like, did you have any conversation with Franciszek from Creativity? Or you just want to bring this topic to our attention?
I just want to bring this topic to your attention.
Okay, so like in any case, like we already like sync up with Franciszek, and we will have the meeting with him today later, probably in 2 or 3 hours. And moreover, we even did some code review for it, but just to like for better visibility, it would be great if you make the presentation of the pull request.
Okay.
Okay. So will you create a meeting for that?
I'm still waiting for Franciszek to confirm the time I proposed.
Okay, so basically the pull request is introducing a new way of generation of interceptors with the goal to move load from the runtime to the basically generation of the interceptors. So in result, the interceptor methods will not rely on configuration, but will have all the plugins and methods included in the generated code. I have seen there are already reviews by Ivan Chepurny that is present on the call, Andrei and Igor, thanks for your review as well yesterday. And yeah, that is achieved by replacing the generator. The generator and related infrastructure files. The only concern that I see is that we are losing dynamics. So in developer mode, we'll have to regenerate the interceptors each time a plugin is added, is introduced. Also, we do have kind of benchmark provided in the pull request. As you can see from benchmark, the first request or the generation of the interceptors will be slowed down after this code change, but eventually we'll have better performance during the runtime.
Andrei, I believe you discovered this pull request from the performance perspective. Do you have any concerns from your side?
I prefer to don't have it in developer mode. So I see that better way to use old approach in developer mode and use new generation only for production. But we can discuss it.
Sorry, so what's the difference between this proposed approach and DI compile?
Sergey, can you please open the results of the generation, how it was and how it's going to be after this?
Actually, not this book is not about performance.
Yeah, here
it's only about how they debug their code, improve developer experience, and slightly improve performance.
Okay, what if you say that you will have to generate interceptors, or you mean that you don't often create interceptors, that's why it's fine, or what was the difference?
Yes, regenerate, it's mean in developer mode.
Yes. So right now we will get the code generated, but we have an issue that you have to regenerate if you make some changes in interceptors or their configuration, right?
Yep.
So that is drawback.
Yep.
And the main benefit which we're trying to achieve is just to have code in place have better debugging experience.
Yeah.
And it's only for interceptors.
I have a small comment from a community perspective. So let's say this plugin, in my opinion, like apart from performance reasons, like performance issue is not as big one here, but the biggest one is actually debugging. So after applying this one, you actually can directly see without a stack trace look up what happens. And let's say if you open a Blackfire on your local and run some profiling with this mode on, you can actually see the actual methods of plugins in a stack trace of Blackfire instead of having call plugins magic from the standard Magento interceptors. That makes debugging very complex.
Yeah, that makes sense. So actually, that's what we wanted to discuss, because we wanted to discuss Andrei's idea whether we need to segregate that for developer mode and for production mode, and because like as we consider that the main benefit of this pull request is to dev experience, improving the dev experience, whether it makes sense to proceed with the same implementation of the plugin as we have now for dev mode.
Yeah, actually, I believe community is best where we can ask about, because only community says that developer mode is too slow in Magento today. So if it's okay for them to decrease performance of developer mode, it's okay for us too, I believe.
Because
do we know how much time the generation will take for the developer mode?
Yeah, increase time of generation 2 times, I believe.
For the first request.
Yeah, for the first request.
So generation.
So I suppose even for the developer mode, there's pros and cons. The pros is that the debugging is easier, but then the con is that the developer mode then becomes dependent on code generation, and I'm not sure like how many developers want to compile code when they're making changes.
So is there still an option to auto-generate it on the fly?
Actually, it's my proposal to make it this way that it not require in developer mode, only in production.
But along with that, we are losing the possibility to debug.
Not
Yeah, what I'm saying, like, if somebody needs it, they can run it. If they don't need it, they may still be auto-generated.
Another possibility, you can configure it in PHP. I provide
option, compilation option.
Why we can't compile it in runtime? What's the issue?
Performance.
But we are still compiling anyways.
Yeah.
Why can we do it transparently?
For performance, for production mode, you can precompile it. So there are no problems.
Yeah, but we're talking about developer mode. So what's the issue? Why can't we recompile it?
After precompile, and if you change, for example, list of plugins, or introduce new plugins, you need to clean up all generated code.
But what's the difference? You need to do it in any way,
No.
in any case.
So for our current implementation of this interceptor, you don't need.
Yes, so there are two drawbacks for developer mode. First, you need to clean the generated code. Maybe it can be addressed by automatic cleaning or providing a command line tool, as somebody suggested in the pull request. And the second is that right now we also do generate interceptors, but with the new approach, with the approach proposed in this pull request, it will be 2 times slower for the first request for the generation. But faster afterwards.
Yes, probably if we could regenerate only affected files, it should be not so bad.
Yeah, but it's hard to know what's because if you, for example, create interceptor on interface, it will affect all the classes that implement the unit. The way to find out what the class is.
And how exactly we are proposing? Is it a new command line or like existing command?
I think it's the same.
Is it still setup.di compile or is some other command?
For now, it just replaces the existing generation. The command line utility to clean and regenerate the existing generated files and developer mode is just a proposal, and it's currently not included with the pull request.
Yeah, but are we talking about the need to generate everything, like factories and everything? Or
No, this is only about interceptors.
But how can you currently generate just interceptors? Yeah, but if you say that we're replacing existing functionality, means that
we are substituting existing code generation for interceptors.
So it means that you will have to invoke setup.di compile, which will generate everything, and you have to wait.
You can just in dev mode you can just sit with the page generation, and in the scope of the handling HTTP request, we will generate all of that stuff.
Yeah, but you will clean up everything, factories, everything. It's just probably the question of how frequently you create or remove a plugin compared to any other work that developers are doing.
So I was actually proposing on this pull request, I was proposing to create a file watcher that watches the file being changed on developer computer and clean the generated classes related to this file based on DI configuration, but nothing about actually recompiling it. So idea behind this is actually just to make sure that when a developer refreshes the browser window, the file that is not generated will be generated automatically by Magento through the standard means without any changes into the way how it's compiled or how compiled classes are generated. It's just a developer tool for making sure when you develop, you don't have to clean generated classes yourself. You can just run a tool as a file watcher and it will clean it for you.
And for file watchers, it doesn't work on all environments. Sometimes file watcher is not available, like with NFS mounts, for example.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean NFS actually, it's stupid to use NFS for your development because NFS is super slow with number of files Magento has. So what I've seen so far in community, there is multiple developers who use different tools, like people use Unison for file synchronization, or this new tool that is available over there. I don't remember. Mutagen, yeah. But the idea is, to run it on your development machine and generate also classes also to have this one synchronized through Unison or any other means with your virtual machine where you run Magento itself. But in general, majority of the systems right now have possibilities to use iNotify or queue poll solutions to poll for possible file changes. And it requires, let's say, developer to install some PHP extensions that will provide this solution, but it's not required to be like a requirement for whole Magento development. It's additional tools that if person wants to, they can install all the required software for it.
Yeah, I believe there is actually a tool like this already developed by Vinay.
Okay, so we already discussing the tool, but we still don't know whether this is a problem for community. So maybe it's not a problem at all. So I propose to create some kind of poll or survey and ask the community whether it's really a problem for them and whether they're changing during the development interceptor so frequently so that their regeneration of all the generated code would be a big issue for them.
I think the issue can be is that, well, it will be unexpected. So for people, you need to know that there's a special behavior if you work with factories versus you work with interceptors. It might be an issue that somebody doesn't know and cannot understand why nothing happens.
Yeah, so it looks like this is really good candidate to be brought to the community and get some feedbacks from their side. So
do you have all these problems, pros and cons described there as well, or
not all of them? So we have just partially like slow down on the first request, and here it's mentioned that we need to remove the who-generated files after the some even slight changes to the interceptor. But yeah, probably we need to describe it a bit broader and bring it to the community.
I think it would be good to have a small design document that at least describes what will change and what are pros and cons, so we can have it on our repo as an artifact. Because I think it's a significant change in the framework.
Yeah, I agree. Probably it will be also beneficial to outline all the cases when generated code should be cleaned. And
we probably can share it with community as well, just to have some context in a document.
Okay, so it looks like we have a resolution here, and we can proceed to another question.
Yes, so the next item, Immutable DTO. Do we discuss it right now?
Yeah, we have Ricardo on a call, yeah. So Ricardo. Right. We can hear you, Ricardo.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, great. So you should also see my screen. So the point is, you don't. Oh my God. Share screen. Okay, screen one. Okay, now should be working. So the point is to add one immutable DTO support in Magento, and I've been working on this for a while. And basically, the idea is just to work with immutable DTOs like this one. You can see my screen. So basically, parameters are injected through constructor, and you only have get parameters. I started working on a class that basically should replace the data object helper that is capable of dealing with this kind of classes. So basically you can use an approach like this one. I'm going to show you. So you create from, so basically you can create from array one DTO class, and basically this DTO class is being generated. This was the easy part. The other part is basically to integrate this behavior with the existing framework. I will try to explain you why, because now most of the objects in Magento are using this method to be populated, that is populated with array, that basically relies on setters. And of course, we cannot rely on setters if we are dealing with immutable DTOs. And now what I'm trying to do, and probably I need some good idea about this, is how to make sure to basically use my new DTO processor for, let's say, extension attributes. So let's imagine we have a Magento class like one product. So and we want to add an extension attribute, and this extension attribute is one immutable DTO. If I try to do this in the current Magento implementation, basically I have a problem because everything is handled by populate with array in a recursive way. So even extension attributes are being populated with this system. I try to create some kind of hybrid approach by creating what I defined an iteration strategy. That basically is the feature of the DTO processor to be able to inject both mutable and immutable objects. But the problem here is that I should replace every single implementation of populate with array in a Magento code. And of course, it's almost impossible because I think I can have a lot of side effects. And this is one problem I think we should discuss about the implementation of the immutable DTO, because I need to find a way to identify one immutable object inside Magento to be sure to use the right approach, populate with array or create from array for the immutables. And plus, I also introduced a kind of, I say a kind of PSR7. So basically, when I'm dealing with immutables, of course, I cannot change the immutable, but I can create a copy of the object with updated information. And if you follow the PSR7, basically every time you call one with function, basically you're creating one copy of the object with one single parameter updated. If we bring this approach to Magento, basically, I think we can blow up every single server of Magento because the objects are quite wide. So I ended up creating a kind of, I call this DTO mutator, that basically is generated class. So I'm using code generation. So let's say I want to mutate this object, test nested DTO. I just call test nested DTO mutator. And I have all the getters basically with the equivalent with method. But instead of having one copy of the object every time I call with, I call a final mutate. So it's like a builder approach. And this is what I'm working on. And the main problem now is how to integrate this in the current Magento implementation because of the populate with array method that was talking about before.
I believe for this we need to use approach like markup interface. I believe
yes, we have been thinking to a market interface, but my concern about a market interface that actually I have a branch with a market interface because I've been running a couple of tests is that we are, I mean, it's a kind of smell because basically we cannot say that one object implementing this interface is actually an immutable object. I know we can apply, let's say, some static test, but you know, it's not a code constraint. So
yeah,
I don't know what you think about.
I have a question, guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
As I understood, this very straightforward data object. In your opinion, does it make sense to move definition of this object into configuration? It will resolve both of problems because we can generate not only builder, which is mutator, I believe, we will be able to generate data transfer object in this way.
Yes.
Also, it will resolve question with a marker interface because in case we have a configuration which has information about all our data objects, it's pretty straightforward to recognize purpose of it and how we can work with it.
This was another idea actually that I've been sharing some months ago with Igor. Actually, was slightly different, but basically it was an XML file defining the DTO. There's no more, and it was auto-generated. So that was basically, I don't know if you mean this way. So you define an XML defining the DTO.
Yep, actually I believe that we can use extension attributes in some kind. So we can extend the XSD scheme of extension attributes and reuse it. So
it's absolutely, it's one option. It's one option, but of course you have XML and not. I mean, of course you generate a class, but you have an XML instead of PHP. I don't know how this is appreciated from Magento developers. So this is absolutely one idea, and I've been even working on this approach because I have several tests.
Yeah, we also can use not XML for definition by some special language like protobuf or some other.
Yes,
Yeah. So
no, but the point is not XML. It is not PHP.
Yep.
So I think this is the point.
Declarative way for DTO is definitely our desirable state, but using this proposal, say we can create the immutable DTO already now, because this proposal is backward compatible, and along with that, it doesn't actually introduce new API, probably except the marker interface, or like we can proceed even without marker interface. But the new declaration, it's going to be kind of new functionality, new API, and we can't release it before 2.4. But already now we have some necessity to introduce immutable objects.
In my opinion, it really depends. In case we are going to switch to configuration at some moment, it makes sense to combine both of approaches, because in other hand, we will have a several approaches how to build immutable objects in our system, and I'm not sure that this will be good. Anyway, adding a new feature, I believe it can be approved as a backward compatible change, because no any of extension will be affected by introducing of a new configuration and a new builder.
Any questions regarding, like, any additional questions regarding is it looks good to you?
Yeah, maybe I have only one question. Is maybe you don't need unmutable at all for the benefit it provides for us.
What do you mean?
I'm sorry.
Why we need unmutable object at all for the benefits it provides?
This is kind of provoking question.
Yep.
Okay, so like the whole idea, like we already discussed this story from the very beginning with Ricardo, but currently, like this was probably several months ago, but now we got back to this idea in the scope of the implementation of the in-store pickup. And currently, like we in MSI architecture, we have the entity of sources, and the source represent actually any source which could be immutable. It can represent like warehouse, brick and mortar store, distribution center, actually whatever.
Yeah, but interruptive. But really, my question, like, do you need to move all our objects to?
No. We are not.
If we don't
Yeah.
need it, I can.
So
it's okay for me. So.
Yeah. So just to emphasize this thing, so we are not trying to refactor or migrate all the existing objects. So we just want to provide a possibility for the new object, if this object need to be created as immutable, to be created as immutable. Okay. So actually, that's the only thing we want to add. And actually, that's why. Yeah, it's backward compatible.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so basically, this is not a new way of thinking to objects, of course. So it is not a fight between mutable and immutable objects. I mean, you should use mutable when you have to use mutable, and immutable when you have to use immutable. But for example, now if you take the request interface object, it's just an example. Why request interface object is mutable?
Because our framework does not provide possibility to create an immutable. Main reason.
Exactly. So basically, sometimes we need to create immutable objects. And now today, Magento is totally missing this aspect, I think.
Yep.
So in general, I believe there is no any objections.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I have just one question for you, because I am quite concerned about this approach with this kind of, let's say, PSR7, because I don't like the builder approach. So I want to know what is your idea, if this is acceptable, or I should be change work.
Sorry, can you clarify your question once more time?
Say again?
Can you clarify your question?
Yeah, so basically when you want to change the information of an immutable object, you have to create a copy of the immutable object, of course.
It's
basically.
Okay.
You create
sorry for interruption. Maybe my concern that's why we are name a builder as a mutator, but I don't know.
Okay, anyway.
My personal opinion, I prefer to have a builder with a prototype because for some reason you may want to change one argument for another case you probably will want to create a new object from prototype. I don't know. It's what it looks like as a builder, and this is up to you how to develop it.
Well, actually, this is not a builder. I mean, this is to change the information of an existing object, not to create the object. Because if you want to create the object, you can do create from array or using a factory and injecting the parameter as you like. This is to basically consider this is almost the same of set ID in the mutable approach.
Let's discuss one case when you have to put your data object as an argument for another plugins, which probably wants to change its state. The main problem with builder and with changing state that we always face when we try to do something like this was exactly this case. That you may have several extensions that may want to change your object on fly during execution.
In this case, it should not be an immutable.
I think. Maybe, but in case we will have a mutable builder and an immutable objects, we probably may say that okay, we have only one event in our system, which is builder create, which allows you to put your extension logic on it. In other hand, all other logic in our system will play with a mutable object.
Okay.
This is just proposal to consider it. I don't know. If you're interested, we can continue this discussion offline.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure.
Is it somewhere in repository where you can see?
Yes, you can see. I have one work in progress branch here. That is the pull request number 22544. I'm working on this, but of course it's a work in progress. So yeah, it's not exactly at its best.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, so let's proceed with code review. There are just 4,000 lines of code need to be reviewed here. So the main point need to be discussed here is how we want to modify our immutable object. Like whether we need to stick with PCR7, whether we need to use the kind of factory-based approach like Ricardo showed here, or whether we'll just say that we don't support any modification. So we will have just
there is one, I believe there is one more option for mutation. You can put this logic inside DTO itself and it will behave pretty much like Haskell or something like that. You just calling the setter, but the object returns.
But actually, this is exactly like PCR7. So this is like what PCR7 recommends, and this is exactly like our initial proposal for the Magento 2 service layer was done like 3 years ago.
Yes, but if you embed the logic in the DTO itself, basically you need to create a copy of the object for each single parameter you're going to change. So the idea of this mutator was to avoid this. So if I need to change, let's say, like in this example I'm sharing, I want to change 3 parameters. I don't need to have 3 copies. I just have 1 copy when I call mutate. So this is the main difference. And I want to discuss about this. So if you think this is correct, or if you prefer to have a PSR7 pure approach, but with clear in mind that we create a copy every single time we call one with.
Yeah, can we have both approach?
Sorry, once again.
Can we have both approach by SR7 is this because I built just different scenario. So you can.
Yes. I think it can be quite confusing from the developer's perspective, but
If you just change one field, you use SR7. If you decide the performance or something matter for you and you need to change many fields, you use better for your scenario approach.
it makes sense,
The
absolutely.
problem with SR7 is, as far as I understand, you get it automatically enabled for all existing DTOs in the system.
No.
Or you still rely on some market.
We will rely probably with the PCR7. We will be relying on some marker interface.
So as soon as we don't enable like for everything automatically.
We are not going to enable it for everything automatically because that would be backwards incompatible.
SR7 is so confusing because it's about HTTP messaging and we're using it inside like mutable context.
It's slightly different. It's in context of HTTP request that, but it's mostly about how to deal with unmutable state.
Okay, so let's proceed with reviewing Ricardo's pull request, and let's discuss the next question. Probably we can schedule the follow-up meeting where we will discuss whether we need to support two options, like immutable object fully and the PCR7 approach, and also discuss the way how we will mutate the immutable object. So thank you, Ricardo, for your presentation. The last but not least today is Ivan Chipurny.
There is one more.
Oh, there is one more? Okay.
Yes. But let's have maybe some time.
I barely believe that there would be time after Ivan.
He has 15 minutes there, so. Let's try.
Vanya, you can start sharing your screen and making presentation.
Shall I start or?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, I just want to. I think we had a little bit of discussion with Andre in pull request. So basically, the current problem we have is that there is locking happening. Wait a second.
Okay.
Yeah, let me share just my complete screen. Okay, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I need to close this one out. Okay, so here's my screen. Very interesting one. So the problem right now is around the way how the cache is getting loaded in Magento. Because in the recent 2.3 release, there was introduced a way to lock cache during writing to it. So let's say when you have a lot of concurrent users and then someone triggers flashing of the system cache, all the concurrent users are getting locked out of accessing the cache. And then, yeah, let's just open the example. And let me actually switch to the original branch and stash my changes. Get okay, so now I can just switch to the develop. account 2.3 develop. So the current issue is around this loading of the data. So there is right now a used method called locked load data, and itself. So first it tries to read the data from cache. If data is not in cache and the data is locked, it will put the process to sleep, and then we'll try to read the data again until the lock is released. And at the same time, afterwards, it tries to acquire the lock until it can acquire it, as I see here. For instance, yeah, there is a while loop until the cache data is actually retrieved. So in cases where, let's say, you have a cache being not generated yet, it puts your Magento request with concurrent requests at the same time, let's say in developer mode, where you have also get PHP involved for static content and everything else. It puts all those processes to sleep until the cache data gets generated. So developers, when they develop something, they feel a lot of lag in accessing the store. However, yeah, there is some merits in actually using locks, because I was working a lot with merchants who have had this problem before in Magento 1, a lot especially, and we had to patch the mage core config model that generates this cache in order to make sure that during the write operation we acquire a lock, and when we acquire a lock, the other processes are not going to overwrite the data after our lock is happening. So before, like, there was implementation that was locking the configuration, but it was not checking if other process just was locking before you actually tried to check if it was locked before. So it's a little bit complicated, the implementation that was happening in Magento 1. In Magento 2, it is solved in such a way. What I was doing for Magento 1 customers, we were just checking initially if the process was locked. Actually, if the cache entry was locked, we were checking it initially, and then after the initial check was happening, we were storing it in a variable, and when we were generating the data, we were checking after the data is generated. If the process was locked before we started generating the data, we just would not save the cache into the storage. So,
Ivan, can you hear me?
Yes.
So just to clarify, to make sure I'm still in context of this discussion. So originally we had a problem. I remember this discussion some time ago. Originally we had a problem where for some clients under high load, we had Redis slaves stop responding, sending null responses to cache requests because they were falling behind replication from us. So we were writing so under high load, when someone flushed cache configuration cache, we were writing so much cache to Redis that Redis couldn't replicate, and it stopped responding, started to send nulls for replication, which would trigger even more cache writing, because every request to Magento would generate configuration cache and write that. So in 2.3, the solution was solved. There were two level solutions to that. First solution was that only one process always writes to cache, right? So in that code, I think, in my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, still makes sense. The discussion was about the other type of code, that like next level optimization that was added in 2.3 that prevented all other processes from generating cache to save resources. I think there was discussion whether it was to fight race condition. I don't think it was about race condition. It was just about preserving resources, right? Yeah. So it was about preserving resources. So why let all the other processes load file system and load the CPU, while only one process does it, and when that process writes cache, everybody else can read it. Now there is a problem with that implementation, my understanding. I'm not sure about all the problems, but at least one that I noticed was that I think dev mode if cache is disabled, I think that's at least that was my understanding that triggered the discussion on Twitter. Someone had, I think, cache disabled, which caused every process to wait for lock and then regenerate because cache was always disabled, right? So now,
yeah, so it's true. Anton, sorry for interrupting you, but yeah, you are completely correct.
Okay, good. So now we are discussing, good, as always. So now we are discussing about, the discussion is about removing this second level optimization because it causes more problems than it solves. So fall back to just having a lock on single process writing to cache, right? And not preventing all other processes from reading. So every process will still read the configuration and merge it and process it, but will not write to cache. So we will still load our CPU and our file system, but that's not a big deal. It's much better than introducing locks that will cause problems in some scenarios, right? Is this overall description of the problem what you're trying to solve, right?
Yeah, so it's basically a good description. I couldn't put it better than you. In general, yes, this is a problem. Apart from that, there is theoretical possibility that under high load, when let's say the cache generation would take a lot of time, that all the backend requests that run concurrently will actually wait for this one to be completed by depleting the FPM process pool on a server. So, but this is, I was unable so far to replicate with load test because I don't have.
But if I understand, I think let's just this is a disclaimer. I think it makes sense to remove this lock because we know at least one scenario where it practically causes problems. We could think about solution to solving the scenario where caches are disabled. But why do that if the benefit of the solution is not such a big? Now, so I think everybody agrees that it should be removed, right? From what I discussed.
Yeah, and actually I have measurements. I can show that on not so big load, but on like 20 concurrent users, 50 concurrent users, among the lock is not. It's degradation like 10%.
Okay, so I think we have general conceptual agreement. So we agree that it should be done, right? So everybody's happy.
Yeah.
Everybody. Now further discussion is just theoretical, right? And
it's theoretical about another issue that could be caused by this additional locking.
If there is lock and every process waits for a lock, they can consume all FPM processes under high load, right?
Yeah, and then they will be unlocked as soon as the cache is generated and stored into the cache storage. But it makes a huge possibility that like our server just waits for cache being generated. And
okay, in
let's
that case,
say,
but how is it different?
And you can imagine, let's say, if in some case the cache server like Redis, let's say, goes down during the write operation, it means until the main process fails, and then locks the cache. Yeah, here it's finally is working, but let's say if this situation happens and somewhere the cache server goes down, it means that then the same problem as in developer mode will happen on production as well, because let's say the cache server becomes unavailable. But
where do we store lock?
Sorry?
Do we store lock in cache server?
No.
Okay. On database.
Okay, so if the cache server becomes unavailable, we'll have the same problem, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So one more reason to remove this locking. Again, I think we could go further and design it, keep the locking, but to but design against those problems, but it's not worth it. So it's much easier to remove it.
So let me just apply some of the changes I was doing. Here is the standard implementation. So this one I didn't touch in my pull request. So I created another method under the lock cache guard class called non-blocking locked load. That's the thing that you just described, that we just check for the lock. And then if the process was locked, we only in this case we save the data. If the process is not locked, and we can acquire the lock. Otherwise, we just return the data that was collected back to the user, so the process works well without generating the data again. Apart from that, after some discussions with Andre, I was thinking, how can we actually improve the generation process? And I created a new callable here called stale data loader. So let's say we can retrieve the data from cache, we just return it back. If it's locked and we have a stale data loader, then we retrieve data with this stale data loader back to the user. Otherwise, we will generate the data for the data collector itself. So the basic idea here is that when we save the original cache, we create as well another entry that will contain a stale cache that we can use to retrieve data during generation for all the other processes. There was valid concern from Andre concerning the page cache and other parts of the system that can be, compromised by the inconsistent data. So let's say you can store the page cache entry in Varnish that would still be served for a long time with this stale cached data, and producing, of course, the wrong data on the front end. However, this one can be solved by just disabling the page cache for the pages that receive a stale configuration cache. So it just can be resolved through the plugin. And another issue was, let's say, when we have other caches apart from page cache, like, let's say, block HTML cache or collection cache that also rely on configuration values, but I already found out that Magento doesn't solve this problem even right now, because if I change a configuration value and flush this configuration cache at the moment, and I have, let's say, another cache that depends on this configuration value, that other cache is not flushed in Magento. So I was able to replicate it by enabling price block HTML cache, changing, let's say, the currency code and removing the currency code from this block HTML cache key. And the problem was reproduced very easily, like Magento doesn't flush block HTML key when we flush configuration cache. So it's very simple one to understand, I think. And then we have already a solution for such cases. Let's say if your data depends on other parameters, like, let's say, currency code or the tax calculation functionality, like tax calculation configuration, or anything else from outside of your internal data that is being returned to be cached, you usually just add this data as a part of the cache key. So when that other data is changing, you would create, let's say, a new cache key entry, and then you will never get a stale cached data for your functionality. So this is actually happens with price block HTML cache. And I don't think like we will have a big problem if we will just serve some stale config cache while other processes, while the main process writes data to cache, we just return back the stale configuration cache for other ones. So it's going to be like a grace period in Varnish cache for cases when the uncached version being requested through the ban. Does it make sense?
Will we have the same problem with stale cache if we need to, we anyway should update it when the new cache is generated? So probably some clients can read this stale cache, and we probably should also lock it if somebody updates.
No. So the thing is that the stale cache is written to. Yeah, let me just show you an example. So we have system cache here. And here, we in the cache data, we just save the main config type, and then we also save this stale cache itself. So this stale cache gets saved during a single locked process. So idea is that we only lock one time, and we only lock during write operation. So we don't lock it during the read. And we don't wait for the lock on the read operation. So we have only one writer, and this one writer is responsible for writing the main cache entry into the cache and also the stale cache entry.
Okay.
Yeah, just remember that stale cache can be invoked from, for example, from Redis without any notification. So you don't need to expect that stale cache is available always.
Yeah, so in case if a stale cache is not there, it will just return false, and it means it will invoke the data generator. So it's as simple as that. So it's also will work in the same way in disabled cache mode. So when we have disabled cache, right, we don't save cache into the cache storage. And in this case, like all the processes generated data, not the cached one.
Okay.
So it's basically the whole thing in the pull request.
Cool. Thank you, Ivan.
Just my 2 cents to this theoretical part. So can we add to our design document that we provide the recommendation to always use optimistic locking strategy than pessimistic, because actually this is a pretty good example of the pessimistic locking strategy, which we are changing to the optimistic one. And we had pretty much the same, for example, for the transaction over the checkout process, which also been removed eventually.
I guess it can be added as recommendation, but I'm not sure if that can be best solution for all cases. So, but definitely as a recommendation should be that optimistic locking should be considered preferred.
Yeah, looks like we are running out of time, and there is no place for the fourth presentation, unfortunately.
So I will move that one probably to the next meeting, and I think it's fine to discuss it in the chat before that.
Cool.
It's about XSS, I think.
By the way, I have one more.
Also, just a quick question for you guys: is if anyone is able to help me out with a small bug I encountered in putting a plugin on a system cache. So maybe someone can help me out with that one, because it's kind of a blocker for my finishing of the pull request. Can someone assist me with that?
Yes, definitely someone can assist. Igor, I think, will be the best one to assist you with that.
Yeah, so we definitely can coordinate you with guys from the community engineering team. I see that Sergey is still on the call, so this guy is actually dedicated for this kind of assistance.
Yeah, but you can just ask it in app design chat, and or we will find someone. Most probably, if I understood the problem that you described correctly, most probably that object is required for plugin mechanisms. That's why you have circular dependency. But that's separate.
Okay, done.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much.